welcome back. So I'm starting with the sky because most of the buildings are whitewashed. So putting in some cobalt blue, and there's pine trees, but they can go on top of the blue sky on this occasion because they're quite dark. Dropping in extra colour into the wet paint in the top right because that's going to be a focal point to give the picture depth. And drying the brush off and just bringing the paint forward roughly to the buildings. And every now and again there's a building that's actually on the skyline. So I'm just going to bring the sky down into a V, and that adds interest as much as anything. I'm going to start with the roof on this one, which is the old watch house. And lots of roofs at the seaside have got lichen on. So I'm just going to mix up a homemade grey using the sky colour to incorporate in that. All the paint mixes will be in the description, and just put on a base colour just to cover the triangle of the roof. And because I've mixed it out of 2 or 3 other colours, it's quite neutral, it's not going to clash with anything. I want the picture to be balanced. Next I'm adding lichen to the roof, which I'm using a bright orangey yellow for. It will be growing where the slates overlap and join, and then where it's in shade it doesn't show so much. So what I'm going to do is put that in just yellow ochre. And then get a brush and just lose the edges of the yellow ochre bit, because that's going to have another coat of grey on to show it's in shade when it's dry. So it's given the indication of the roof. Now it's not flat white, it's made out of stones, so there's lumps and bumps showing. So the first thing I'm going to do is put on the guttering, which is modern, and if a building is really wobbly it's a good way of getting a straight edge. So to start with I'm just put in the horizontal guttering. And that goes slightly over the edge of the building and stops at the roof window, and then goes on to the other side and back round the corner. And then there's a hint of it going down, but not much, it gets lost. I'll just make this side slightly stronger. It's because it's old, you can see gaps behind the guttering where the roof's not level. And the same colour I can use where they've stained the wooden beams. Obviously a very long time ago somebody used that piece of wood. And the same for downstairs. That looks slightly more modern because it's straighter. And that's set in the colour scheme now that I've got the darkest colour I'm going to use. I'm now going to put in the roofs of the fishermen's net stores and things. Some of them have been re-roofed and some are original, so the different shades of grey and different degrees of lichen on them. But they're all simple shapes. So once you've got one in which you can pick off against the house, you can carry on quite easily. Just keep changing the colours. So I'm just using a warmer homemade grey for the next one, and then changing levels, and then the other one is catching the light differently. It's dark in one corner and then going up to a lighter area. So changing colour, going back to the homemade grey, just taking the paint up to the top. So I've come down to the harbour wall next, which I'm going to use a warm colour. I'm going to use Naples yellow and yellow ochre together. Just do up and down strokes. And there are some big stones showing, and it's very brown towards the bottom, so I'm going to use raw umber and just a tiny bit of blue from the sky just to make it a bit darker, and then drop in a dark line. The wall does go round a little bit of a corner, so it's much darker by the second roof. And then there's more sun catching it. And then coming up halfway with the dark, is obviously where the tide comes up to. And then get some Payne's grey, just drop in some dark squiggles. Just gives the effect of stones. I'll put the ladders on later. And then moving along, I've got more roofs going up, and they are mostly local slate again. So I'm just going to add a house that's prominent, that's easy, and then I can pick other things off from it. A little bit darker in places. I will rub some of the pencil lines back in a while, but I need them at the moment just to help me find my way, because there's quite a lot of shapes here. I've got one roof on top of another, so I did the first roof up and down. I'm doing the second one sideways just to separate it slightly. And then I've got a roof going completely the opposite direction here. And then going up, they seem to have attracted more lichen. So I'm just going to do this one in orange, and then I'll drop some dark in on top, because when I look at it, it is mostly orange. I'll leave that one for a moment and go further up the hill. I've got quite a shallow roof. I'm just going to take some of the colour off, as it's further up and it's more distant. Different levels of reflected light. I'm going to do the alley that's in shadow. So I need to tint the white buildings. So I'm going to use the sky colour, just tint the front of them. I'll put in the windows afterwards, but I just want to separate them from the main house. I don't want them to look blue, but just look in the shade, and take them down to pavement level. And I've got a chimney that's also in the shade, so I'm just going to make that a little bit blue, but not all over, just sort of a bit of dappled colour. And then behind that I've got some roofs, so I'll just put the grey on first and then the lichen on top. I'll do it wet into wet, because it is quite dramatically lit. It's catching the sun there. And then further up the hill I've got a grey roof that's not catching the sun so much, but needs to be there. Got to give the character of the village. The second one's more indistinct because there's a tree going across it. Put in some of the trees, and then I've got the colour tones. And most of them are evergreens, and they've got lots of little leaves and pine needles. So I'm adding some green to the sky colour that I now don't need anymore. Always keep the colour in case. And adding some yellow ochre to it. And I'm going up from the roofs. When they go down the side of a house, they're sometimes in a little bit of shade, but I'm just going to put them on for now. Then changing my colour mix, a little bit of chrome yellow, just put in the side of my mix. And there will be some shadows where the trees are in the shade of each other. I can add those in a moment. I just claim the space. And it's making the houses now look more forward. Now going further up the hill, I'm just changing colour again, adding a little bit more of the sky colour this time, which will make the hillside recess. And then the trees are catching the sun again, so they're getting more yellow as they go up, making the paint fractionally stronger. Now I'm changing to dark now, so I'm going to mix some Payne's Grey with that original mix, or any dark colour that you've got. And go around the white chimney. Around some of the roofs. Just making a few more suggestions. I'm going to change to a smaller brush. Just go down to some of the roof levels. Make it indistinct because I'm never sure where things start and finish. And it's easier if you've been tentative. To make the pines look more convincing, you just got to drop wet into wet to make some of the areas stronger. The branches sort of go in clusters. But you can still see the sky through them. And then in the middle, I'm just going to make it a slightly brighter colour where it's just catching the sunlight a little bit. Make it look slightly more three-dimensional. And then going for a mid-tone, a little bit more of the sky blue, where there's undergrowth under the trees. Then back to the dark colour again, where the trees are in shadow of each other. But the branches on one side, which in this case is more the right, are in more shade. And they continue like that all the way up the hillside. I've just given the trees a moment to dry, and you can see the same trees through an open window. So I'm just going to put in 4 little marks to indicate that, because the window frame is white. And then there's another window in complete shadow. And lastly, the roof, which from this angle looks slightly brown. There's a light grey area which will make the first house look brighter, so I'll put that in. And then there's a line on the roof which looks like it's got lots of lichen. It's looking quite orangey brown. It's a bit wobbly because it's quite old. And then there's trees above that and the hint of another house. So for the hint of another house, I'm going to leave just a white paper, but I'll just bring the trees down in a squiggle or two. Some of them are quite yellowy, catching the sun. And there's some very dark ones, so I'll just add some Payne's Grey to the green. Leave a gap for the house, which handle is just above the window so I can find it easily. All I can do is leave a square for it. And then bring the trees up around it. And I need it to be a little bit darker just to separate it from the line. So I'll drop in some Payne's Grey and then drop in some brighter green. Just let them merge. And it takes your eye away from it being a parallel line to the roof. And there's some trees going across the area that's in shade here that will help give some tones and make the roofs look in scale. So I've just dropped it in one green, Now I'm going to go in with the darker green that's got the Payne's grey in. Just drop it in at random so that it's not solid. So moving forward, I can now put gutters on these fishermen's huts. It may seem a strange thing to do, but I need some dark there to punctuate it. So they are further away and catching the light differently. And then the front of the buildings is stone, so I'm changing to a bigger brush, and I'm just going to use a little bit of homemade grey with Naples yellow, just to make a light stone colour. And the windows are dark, so I can go over all of them at this stage. And then warming up the colour slightly as it comes nearer. I'm also going to warm up the stone wall that I put in first of all. I'm going to use a mixture of earth colours, so I've got a little bit raw sienna and burnt sienna together. I'm just going to go across the whole lot, allowing room for where the sun was shining through. And I'm going to make that colour slightly darker with some Payne's grey and take it down into the area that's water. Get a smaller brush and just add a reflection of some of the ladders in yellow ochre, because that will chemically move the other paint, so it's doing the job for me. And then round the white boat, and that's got a few things on top, so I'll do a loose line around it. Making the paint slightly darker as I'm coming forward. As it gets nearer, the water's gone out, so it's quite green from seaweed. As long as it's dark, it'll help show the white building. But going in with a little bit Payne's grey on top of that. And then back to some yellow. Just drop it in. And then use a wet brush just to lose any hard edges, because there isn't really any definition there. And then a little bit more of the yellow ochre again to show a couple more ladders. And using a small brush, just go up and down for the rectangular windows. Most of them are dark. There's a reflection in some of them. I'm just going to drop some wet paint in. And then just get a brush, just move it around a little bit. It's something white in the bottom left, but I've made it a richer colour because the building's white and it won't necessarily show. Then there's a plaque at the top that actually says the old watch house. And then coming down, the windows are just as dark, and again just dropping a little bit of paint in. And then there's only half a pane showing further down because the plants are growing up. And then inside you can just see in a little bit, so I've got a slightly different colour. The door's open and you can see in, but it's not all one colour, so I'm going to add some Azilian Crimson and just drop it into the wet paint because it's a warm colour against the cool white. And then at the top, just drop in some wet into wet, some of the paint grey again, and then just move it and it'll find its own way. And the window frame is wood, so I can't do that until it's dry. So I can move on to the wall, which I'm going to use homemade grey to start it off, and the stones are put on sideways on top. Then I'll change to a little bit of yellow ochre and go in between just to show the difference in the natural stone. And it is still wet, but they should still remain separated because of the colour differences. And then as the wall changes to going down to the street level, the stones go the other direction. So just do them like bricks, offset from the one on top. And I'll just make it darker at the bottom in a minute, just to show that it is now a footpath at the bottom. And I need a lost edge, so I can use my finger for that. The watch house is standing out really nice now as brilliant white, even though it's just a white paper. So I'm going to gradually work round to make things slightly darker or brighter around it to maintain its contrast. So I can add a little bit more to the wall. Just adding a homemade grey and then a little bit extra yellow ochre just to separate the grey, give some contrast. Then I've got a donations box and a plaque. Now the alleyway has got some dark guttering and things, so I'm just going to use a little bit of Payne's grey and do a few areas that I can easily identify. I'm just going to make that a little bit darker to separate it from the homemade grey. Some of these colours affect the colour next to it, so just make it a bit darker with adding a little bit of indigo. So I use the dark colour again just to go in to show where windows are. Just a dark line, and just lose the edge of that. Don't want anything too definite, just lost and found edges. So there's lots of hydrangeas in the garden. So before I lose the space, I'm going to put the pink in. So I've got rose madder here, and I'm just going to add a little bit of Naples yellow to it, just to lift it a little. I don't want the flowers to change the colour balance. So I'll just put in some squiggles, clean the brush off, and then go back with the rose madder again. And just drop it into the wet paint. And get some water. Just give it a little stir. Hydrangeas have got lots and lots of heads. So in the painting of this scale, all you can do is move the paint around. They're so small that you just need to suggest them. Now the alleyway is quite dark, which makes the building stand out a little bit. So I'm going to just put some blue in there, just to make the white building stand out a little bit more. And then again, get the brush, just lose the paint at the edge so there's not a sharp line. Now I'll put the greenery in around the flower heads. It doesn't matter if it bleeds slightly. I'm starting with sap green. I'm going to tint it slightly with a little bit of lemon yellow. Just take the brush for a walk. Go back in with a slightly bluer mix in a moment and just drop some wet into wet. But it mustn't be dominant because the whole picture is about the cottage. And then gently make marks in a different direction. I'm doing these up and down. And because it's wet, it'll find its own route. And then just add a little bit of yellow to it to give variety. If you've got yellow anywhere, it has a chemical reaction like opposite magnets, and it will send the paint away, which gives you highlights without. So I'm just going to paint a rectangle. I'm just going to make it a little bit brighter with some burnt sienna, just to separate it from the stone in the wall. As I say, I want the picture to harmonise. I don't want anything to stand out apart from the cottage. And then there's a little plaque on the top which has got a black edge, so going for an even smaller brush, I'll just do the edges, and then it's got lots of writing on which I can't do in this scale, so I'm just going to take the brush for a walk, and in this case I'm doing it backwards. Now the bottom windows have got brown window surround, so while I've still got the small brush, I'm going to do those with a mixture of burnt sienna and yellow ochre, and it starts with a frame. If you're not sure about doing windows, just look for the most obvious part. And then do the glazing bars. And the far frame. Well, the door is open, and that's got white paint on the glazing bars. So the only thing to do is to paint in the negative and do the window panes. There seems to be about 9 of those showing, so I'll start in the middle, do what I'm sure about, then go up from that. What I'm going to do is wet the roof where there's a shadow, and then drop the paint into the wet area. And I'm just using some indigo with the homemade grey that I've got. And because I've wet it, I can put it on without disturbing the lichen that's already there. And then there's a smaller area here, so I needn't wet it. And then a shadow cast into the harbour itself. Let's make that a bit stronger, so it shows up on the brown that's already there. And that will make the white boat look bright. Harbour bottom. Now obviously it's not all one colour, so I'll go to my palette, and I've already got the brown I use for the door. That could look like dark sand. Put that in. Then some of the shadow colour. Just merge it all together. And I'm going to lose the edge because I've got some boats to put in. Next I've got to pick out one boat to start with, and I've got a white boat with a dark gunnel and a dark bottom. So I'm going to use a number 2 brush, and the boats are slightly at an angle because they're leaning as the tide went out. So I'll put the gunnel in first with one stroke, and then go back and make it darker. And again with the bottom of the boat, just make a line. And then I've got a dark blue boat next to it, so I'm going to use a French ultramarine and a tiny bit of the indigo. do the same thing. With boats you do get lost edges when they're leaning. So I'm going to dry the brush and just move the paint that I've already got down. And then I've got a wooden boat. So I'm going to use yellow ochre to start with. Dry the brush and just move the paint that I've just put down. And I've got boats in front of them, but I don't necessarily want to put every boat in the harbour in. So you just have to choose how many you want. Now the boat that's catching the sun has got a lovely red bottom that's showing, so I'm just going to use some Indian red and just put that in. And you could actually just put 1 or 2 boats in. You needn't have to put everything in that's in the harbour, but there are some white boats which are quite interesting. Mixing the yellow ochre with the indigo and other colours I've used, and just go round the boats. Not painting the boats, but painting the surroundings. Well, it just leaves a nice pattern. Again, lose the edge of the paint. Take it back to infinity. Just going to add a few different colours here. I have got a bigger fishing boat on the right, so I'm going to get some blue paint and do underneath that. That's giving quite a little bit of reflection. There's just a puddle of water. The fishing boat is on a different scale. So I'll find the gunwale and then start the cabin and the superstructure, the roof, split windscreen, and then more blue. And just shape it a little. Now there's lots of reflections behind it, so I'm going to go in with yellow ochre and I'm going to do the reflections sideways. So I'm just going to put in 2 or 3 and then I'll join them up with some yellow paint just to separate them. And then take it back a little bit further to the white boat. I'm working my way around the front of the picture. It's looking for things that I can highlight just to make it a little bit more vibrant. And I've got some Indian yellow, which is like a thin orange. It's quite transparent. And just putting it on top of the roof here, just to give a little bit of punch. The lichen at the seaside is very bright, and as something that adds to the colour scheme. I'm just putting some on and then moving the paint. And just getting homemade grey, just making the roof a little bit darker. You get all the colours on, some just need adjusting. And there's some greenery on top of the wall, so I'm picking a smaller brush, starting with the sap green again because I want continuity in the picture. Just doing up and down strokes for the plants that are growing on top of the wall. And then a little bit of yellow ochre, just to make the tones more in harmony with the surrounding area. And then another lick of paint on the wall, just to make it all blend in tonally. I'm going to get a flat brush, because I've got one. If you haven't got a flat one, it doesn't matter. Just mix all the colours together and go over the wall one more time to show the shape of the stones and slates that make up the top of the wall. Now returning to the boats. Now these would look better if there was some chains and ropes around. So I'm just going to mix up a dark colour and just make sure some indication of the boats. And then I've got a boat with a little mast, which is wooden. So I'm going to just put that in. You only have to make a suggestion, and it's actually taller than that, so I'm just going to clean the brush off a little bit and take the paint up again. Now, what makes a boat look authentic is a little bit of detail. So the white boat has got fenders. Boats have fenders so that they don't do too much damage when they go into these old harbour walls that are stone. So just going to make a little bit of dark blue up, and not put in the fender but the shadow of the fender. Just make a little line. I'll just put a couple of windows in, and there's a shorter window on the side. And the only way I can make the cabin look square is not to touch the white, but to touch the area around it. And the same with the next one, that it's just seaweed and the foreshore behind it. So let's go around, avoiding the mast that's not quite dry yet. A little bit of green paint. A couple of different ways of colour. I'll put those in the same colour at the moment, and then I'll just make them a bit darker with different blues. I don't want the boat to dominate the picture, but I want it to stand out as being more substantial. And it's got a life buoy on top. I haven't put the top in yet, so I can do that. The fishing boat's got a lot more structure, so I'm just going to put some rails in. And just add a little bit more detail to the roof. Gouache on top of the railings to give them a bit of shine. Now, all fishing boats have a number, but I'm not giving them numbers. I'm just doing a mixture of boats. But all the boats in this area are all got the local initials. So we'll put the initials in and just a hint of a number. And the same with this one. That's the town that they're registered near. So now I've got to go back to what were the old net lofts. Just give a suggestion of things. Don't worry about doing too much detail. Just breaks up the building. Some windows and doors do disappear because the area has been changed over the years and there's old walls and things. So I now need to break up the area behind them. And I start with a grey roof. So I'm going to come out sideways for a grey roof just to break up the buildings, and slightly tapered at either end. And then it goes up to a chimney. When buildings are white, all you can do is look for something that isn't white. And then there's a couple of roof lights, so I'm just going to put in a couple of straight lines and then work round them. And then there's another one that's quite covered in lichen, so don't want too much of a shock, so I'm going to use yellow ochre. I want them to recess, not come forward. And put some lichen on that one as well. To help the contrast and scale of the picture, I'm just going to put in some ladders on the fishing quay. These are wooden ladders that are catching the sun, so I'm going to start with putting in the wall that you can see through them. So just doing some sideways lines. That's the best way of getting the shape of the ladder, and then you can add other things later. So just put the rungs in. And there's a rusty old ladder that's much smaller, so cleaning the brush off, just going in a different scale. And then there's a few little things. I've just added a few shrubs and things that I've found around the houses, which helps break up the white area. And then there's the first building, you can just see, because it's an oblique angle, windows. And it helps separate the front and side of the building. And then the next one, slightly better angle, you can see a hint of doors. I'll just carry on like that until I think I've found everything that matters. So now I can go with a very light colour, and I think it's going to be yellow ochre, just softened with a little bit of French ultramarine, and just do the ladders. And then there's one that was rusty, so I'm going to use Indian red for that. And it's rails down steps, but the plants are in front of the steps. So I'll just put the rail in. And a few uprights. You can only really see a couple of them. And then somebody seems to have left something there, but it might be part of the garden furniture, so I'll put it in. And then there's a light which I can put in, and an anchor on the wall, which is quite fun. Just take the brush for a walk. And I'll lighten the paint slightly and put a few leaves in here as well. Just a fraction. Now the building is stone, so I'm going to use a flat brush, a medium one. Just get some grey, almost like dirty water really, nothing too much, and just go sideways. Just make little marks so where the facets of the stone are just visible. If you try and do it at random, hopefully you won't get a pattern that dominates the picture. And that's just broken it up so you can see it's a stone building. And then there's a deep shadow on the wall, which will all help make the main building look darker. And a little windowsill. Some of these are slate. I'll just use a mid-grey. Well, there's a distinctive line above here, which could be from years ago. There was a different sign there or something. Thank you for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed watching the video.